What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks into what should be a routine late-night interview, only to face a host who seems determined to provoke him at every turn? In just 38 seconds of mounting tension, after a seemingly innocent question, a simple conversation about personal beliefs spiraled into one of the most shocking and explosive ejections in talk show history. This is the story of how Stephen Colbert went from charming, witty host to antagonistic, confrontational interviewer, deliberately pushing Samuel L. Jackson to a breaking point that nobody in the audience, the crew, or even the cameras saw coming. The interview started normally enough. Samuel L. Jackson walked onto the stage with that confident stride everyone knows him for. The swagger that made him famous in movies like Pulp Fiction and The Avengers was on full display. The audience went absolutely wild. They loved him. They cheered and applauded so loudly that Stephen had to wait several seconds before speaking. Samuel smiled and waved to the crowd, soaking in their energy. He sat down in the guest chair, adjusted his jacket, smiled at the cameras, and shook Stephen's hand firmly. Everything seemed perfectly fine at first. The atmosphere felt warm and welcoming. The lights were bright, illuminating the stage in that familiar late-night television glow. The crowd was excited and energetic, eager to hear what Samuel had to say, but something was different about Stephen that night. Something subtle that most people didn't notice at first. There was an edge in his voice, a sharpness in his tone that people in the audience started to notice right away. His smile seemed forced. His laugh sounded hollow. It was like he had something planned, something brewing beneath the surface. Stephen opened with what seemed like a simple question about Samuel's new movie. It was the kind of softball question every talk show starts with. Samuel answered with genuine enthusiasm, talking animatedly about the director's vision, the complexity of the story, and what specifically drew him to the project in the first place. He spoke with real passion, the way he always does when he talks about his work. His eyes lit up as he described a particular scene. He used his hands to illustrate action sequences. The audience was completely engaged, nodding along, laughing at the right moments, hanging on his every word. Samuel was doing exactly what a good guest does. He was entertaining, informative, and personable. But Stephen barely seemed interested at all. He wasn't really listening to the answers. His eyes kept darting to his note cards. He was just waiting for his turn to speak again. And then, right in the middle of Samuel describing an emotional moment in the film, Stephen cut him off mid-sentence without any warning. "Let's talk about something more interesting," Stephen said abruptly, leaning back in his chair with this knowing smirk spreading across his face. His tone was dismissive, almost condescending. Samuel paused mid-thought. You could see his expression change slightly, just a flicker of confusion crossing his features. He stayed professional, though, keeping his composure intact. He nodded slowly and waited for the next question, giving Stephen the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was just transitioning topics. Maybe this was part of his interview style. The audience got noticeably quieter, sensing something was off. The energy in the room shifted from excitement to uncertainty. A few people in the front row exchanged concerned glances. "So, Samuel," Stephen continued, shuffling his note cards unnecessarily, dragging out the moment for dramatic effect. "I've been reading quite a bit about your stance on some political issues lately. You've been pretty vocal about your opinions." "Very vocal, actually." Samuel shifted slightly in his seat, his body language becoming more guarded. "Well, yes," he said calmly, maintaining eye contact with Stephen. "I think it's important for people to speak up about what they believe in. I've always believed that." Sure," Stephen said, waving his hand dismissively through the air like he was swatting away Samuel's words. "But don't you think actors should just stick to acting? I mean, really, who actually wants to hear political opinions from someone who pretends to be other people for a living? That's what you do, right? You memorize lines someone else wrote and say them convincingly." The audience gasped audibly. Several people in the crowd made sounds of surprise and discomfort. A few people laughed nervously, desperately hoping this was part of some elaborate bit they weren't in on. But the tension was palpable. This didn't feel scripted. Samuel's face showed clearly that this wasn't a joke they'd planned together. His jaw tightened visibly, his eyes narrowed slightly. He took a slow, measured breath before responding, clearly trying to maintain his composure. "I think everyone has the right to express their views," Samuel said carefully, keeping his voice remarkably steady despite the obvious provocation. "Actors are citizens too. We pay taxes just like everyone else. We vote. We care deeply about the future of this country and the world we're leaving for the next generation. Being an actor doesn't disqualify me from having opinions or sharing them. But do you really understand these complex issues? Stephen pressed, leaning forward now with an almost aggressive posture. Or are you just reading talking points that someone on your team gave you? I mean, let's be honest here. You're not a political scientist. You're not an economist. You're not a policy expert. You're an entertainer. Samuel's eyes narrowed further. His entire demeanor shifted from friendly to defensive in an instant. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice dropping to a lower register. "I'm just saying," Stephen continued, that infuriating smirk still plastered on his face. "It's very easy to have strong opinions about complicated issues when you're making millions of dollars per movie and living in a completely insulated bubble. You're fundamentally disconnected from the real people facing real problems in this country. How can you possibly speak to their experiences?" The tension in the studio was becoming unbearably thick now. You could almost feel it pressing down on everyone. The audience wasn't laughing anymore, not even nervous laughter. They were watching with wide eyes and open mouths, completely captivated but also uncomfortable, waiting anxiously to see what would happen next. Some people were starting to pull out their phones, sensing they were about to witness something significant. Samuel sat up straighter in his chair, his shoulders squaring, his posture becoming more rigid and defensive. "You don't know anything about my life," Samuel said, his voice becoming noticeably firmer but still impressively controlled. "You don't know where I came from or what I've experienced in my nearly 7 decades on this planet. I grew up in segregated Tennessee during some of the darkest days of American racism. I marched for civil rights alongside people who risked their lives for equality. I've seen real struggle up close. I've lived through things you've probably only read about in history books. So don't you dare suggest I don't understand real problems." Stephen waved his hand again with that same dismissive gesture, like he was literally brushing off everything Samuel had just said. "Oh, here we go with the old struggle stories. Everyone's got a struggle story, Samuel. Everyone's overcome something. But right now, today, in this moment, you're part of the elite class. You're part of the Hollywood establishment. You're part of the problem we're talking about." "The problem?" Samuel repeated slowly, his voice rising slightly in volume and intensity. "What exactly is the problem you think I'm part of? Please, enlighten me. Hollywood elites telling enough? Regular hardworking Americans how to think and what to believe," Stephen said, his voice taking on a lecturing quality. "You people live in massive mansions behind gates and security. You fly around on private jets. You vacation on yachts. And then you have the audacity to lecture middle-class families about inequality and fairness. Don't you see how that's fundamentally hypocritical?" Samuel stared at Stephen for a long, uncomfortable moment. The silence stretched out awkwardly. The camera zoomed in slowly on Samuel's face, capturing every micro-expression. You could see the anger building steadily behind his eyes, simmering just beneath the surface, but he was clearly holding it back with tremendous effort. He was trying desperately to stay professional, trying to give Stephen one more chance to back down from this confrontational approach. The muscles in his jaw were working as he clenched and unclenched his teeth. First of all, Samuel began slowly and deliberately, choosing each word with careful precision. "I don't lecture anyone about anything. I share my perspective on issues I care about. People are completely free to agree or disagree with me. That's their absolute right in a free society. Second, yes, I've been very fortunate in my career. I've worked hard for decades to get where I am, but I use my platform, my visibility, to try to help people who need it. I support numerous charities financially. I speak up for those who don't have a voice or a platform. I use my influence to try to make positive change. So let me turn this around and ask you something. What do you do besides sit here in your comfortable chair and mock your guests on national television?" Stephen's smirk finally faded from his face. He seemed genuinely surprised that Samuel had pushed back so directly and forcefully. Most guests don't challenge the host like that. They smile and deflect. They laugh it off. They play along with whatever dynamic the host creates. But instead of acknowledging the valid point Samuel had just made or backing down from his aggressive line of questioning, Stephen doubled down even harder. "I'm doing my job," Stephen said defensively, his voice taking on an edge. "I'm asking tough questions that need to be asked. Maybe you're just not used to being challenged. Maybe you're so surrounded by yes men and people who agree with everything you say that you've forgotten what real discourse looks like." "Challenged?" Samuel let out a short, bitter laugh that echoed through the now silent studio. This isn't you challenging me intellectually. This is you being deliberately disrespectful for absolutely no good reason. There's a massive difference between asking genuinely tough questions and just being outright rude to someone. You're not interested in my answers. You're interested in creating conflict for your ratings. Maybe you're just too sensitive. Stephen shot back quickly, almost reflexively. Maybe you can't handle criticism. That was it. That was the breaking point. That single comment was the straw that broke the camel's back. Samuel's expression changed completely in an instant. The professional mask he'd been maintaining so carefully just dropped away entirely. He stood up abruptly from his chair, the movement sudden enough to startle the audience. The microphone still clipped to his jacket made a loud rustling sound that echoed through the speakers. "You know what?" Samuel said, his voice significantly louder now, projecting across the entire studio. "I came here tonight to talk about my work, to have a genuine conversation with you and your audience, to promote my film and share some stories. But you clearly had a completely different agenda from the start. You wanted to provoke me. You wanted to bait me into an argument. You wanted to make me look bad for your ratings and your viral clips. Well, congratulations. You succeeded in being unprofessional." Stephen stood up too, quickly, almost stumbling, slightly in his haste. He was clearly trying to regain some semblance of control over the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Samuel, come on now," he said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that sounded almost desperate. "Sit back down. Let's continue the interview. We can talk about whatever you want." "No," Samuel said firmly, shaking his head definitively. "I don't think so. I really don't. This isn't an interview. This stopped being an interview about 5 minutes ago. This is an ambush. This is you trying to embarrass me on your show. And I absolutely do not need to sit here and be systematically insulted by someone who apparently thinks he's better than everyone else just because he has a television show." The audience was completely silent now. Dead silent. You could hear a pin drop in that massive studio. No one knew what to do or how to react. This was unprecedented territory. The producers backstage were probably having complete panic attacks, frantically trying to figure out how to handle this situation. This kind of thing wasn't supposed to happen on late-night television. Talk shows have disagreements sometimes, sure. Hosts and guests might spar verbally a bit. But guests don't just walk off the stage, especially not guests like Samuel L. Jackson, one of the biggest movie stars in the world. Stephen tried desperately to laugh it off, forcing out an awkward chuckle that sounded painfully fake. "Oh, come on now, Samuel. Don't be so dramatic about this. We're just having a conversation here. This is what we do. We talk, we debate, we disagree sometimes. Dramatic?" Samuel turned around to face Stephen directly, squaring his shoulders. "You systematically called me disconnected from reality. You explicitly said I'm part of the problem with this country. You strongly suggested I'm just mindlessly reading talking points written by other people. You directly implied I'm a hypocrite who doesn't understand the issues I talk about. And now you have the nerve to stand there and tell me I'm being dramatic for standing up for myself and my integrity?" Stephen opened his mouth to respond, probably to make another excuse or deflection, but Samuel held up his hand firmly, palm out, in a clear stop gesture. "No," Samuel said emphatically. "I'm done with this. I'm completely done. I've been in this business for more than 4 decades. I've done literally thousands of interviews all over the world. I've dealt with tough questions from serious journalists. I've dealt with critics who disagree with my work. I've dealt with people who vehemently oppose my political views. But I have never, not once in all those years, had a host treat me with such blatant, obvious disrespect. You brought me here under completely false pretenses. You told my publicist this would be a fun, lighthearted interview about my new film. But you wanted to create drama. You wanted to manufacture controversy. And you got it. But not the kind you wanted. Not the kind where I lose my temper and say something you can use against me. Instead, you get this. You get me walking away with my dignity intact." Samuel started walking purposefully toward the side of the stage, his stride confident despite the chaos of the moment. Stephen followed him several steps, still desperately trying to salvage what was rapidly becoming a complete disaster for his show. "Samuel, wait!" Stephen called out, his voice echoing slightly in the silent studio. "If you leave now, you're just proving my point. You're proving you can't handle any criticism at all." Samuel stopped in his tracks and slowly turned around one final time. The camera captured his face perfectly in that moment. The lighting hit him just right. He looked directly at Stephen with an intense, unwavering gaze. Then he looked at the stunned audience, making eye contact with several people in the front rows. Then he looked directly into the main camera, speaking to everyone watching at home. "Criticism?" Samuel said, his voice clear and strong. "This wasn't criticism, Stephen. Criticism is thoughtful. Criticism is substantive. Criticism is based on actual arguments and evidence. What you did tonight was cheap. It was lazy. It was designed purely to provoke rather than illuminate. And I don't participate in cheap theatrics. I have too much respect for myself and too much respect for the people who support my work." He reached up with both hands and carefully unclipped the small microphone from his jacket lapel. The sound of the metal clip being removed echoed through the completely silent studio, amplified by the remaining microphones. It was such a simple action, but it felt momentous. Final. He held the microphone for a moment, looking at it, then handed it to a nearby crew member who looked absolutely shell-shocked. "Good luck with the rest of your show tonight," Samuel said to Stephen, his tone almost pitying. Then he turned his attention to the audience, one last time. "Thank you, all for coming out tonight. I genuinely appreciate your support over the years. I'm truly sorry you had to witness this uncomfortable situation. You deserve better." And with that final statement, Samuel L. Jackson walked off the stage with his head held high. He didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. He just walked steadily toward the exit and disappeared behind the heavy curtain. The audience sat completely frozen in their seats. No one clapped. No one cheered. No one said anything at all. They just watched in stunned silence as one of the biggest movie stars in the world walked away from a major television interview. Stephen stood there awkwardly in the middle of the stage, his earlier smirk completely gone now, replaced by a look of genuine shock. He looked at the cameras, then down at his desk, then back at where Samuel had exited, clearly completely unsure what to do next. His confident host persona had evaporated entirely. "Well," Stephen finally managed to say, after what felt like an eternity of uncomfortable silence, trying desperately to force a smile that looked more like a grimace. "That was certainly unexpected. Let's go to commercial break." The words came out flat and hollow. The cameras lingered on him for just a few extra seconds before finally cutting away, and in those few seconds, you could see his professional facade completely crumble. His shoulders slumped. His smile disappeared. He looked genuinely shaken by what had just transpired. The audience started murmuring among themselves immediately, shocked and confused by what they'd just witnessed live. But the damage was already done. The cameras had captured everything, every insult, every dismissive gesture, every moment of escalating tension. They kept rolling for several extra seconds before finally cutting to commercial, and you could see Stephen's face drop completely as soon as he thought the cameras were off. He looked genuinely shaken. His hands were trembling slightly as he picked up his note cards. The confident, smirking host from just minutes earlier was gone, replaced by someone who looked like they'd just witnessed a car crash. The studio audience started talking among themselves in hushed, urgent whispers, clearly shocked by what they'd just witnessed firsthand. Backstage, the scene was pure chaos. Samuel was already out the building's back door before most people even realized what was happening. He didn't stop to talk to anyone from the show. He didn't wait around for explanations or apologies from producers. He didn't give anyone a chance to try to smooth things over or convince him to come back. He just left immediately. His publicist followed quickly behind him, phone already pressed to her ear, probably already calling his manager and preparing damage control statements for the inevitable media storm that was about to hit. Within minutes, Samuel was in his car and gone, leaving the studio behind. When the show came back from the commercial break, Stephen had to continue without his scheduled main guest. The energy in the studio was completely different now. Heavy, awkward, uncomfortable. He brought out the musical act much earlier than planned, completely disrupting the show's carefully planned flow. He tried desperately to act like everything was completely normal, like nothing unusual had just happened. But it wasn't normal. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. The audience seemed deeply uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, avoiding eye contact with the stage. Stephen's jokes fell completely flat. No one laughed. The applause was sparse and obligatory. He kept glancing nervously toward the side of the stage where Samuel had made his dramatic exit. Like some part of him was still hoping Samuel might come back and they could pretend the whole thing was just an elaborate bit. But Samuel didn't come back. Of course he didn't. Why would he? He'd made his point crystal clear. He'd drawn a line in the sand and enforced his boundaries. He wasn't going to be disrespected on national television just for ratings, no matter how big the platform was. And that's what made the moment so incredibly powerful and significant. Samuel L. Jackson didn't need that show. He didn't need that platform to promote his movie. He didn't need Stephen Colbert's approval or audience. He had nothing to prove to anyone. By walking off that stage, he showed everyone watching that he valued his dignity and self-respect more than any amount of publicity or exposure. It was a masterclass in standing up for yourself. The rest of the episode was excruciatingly awkward to watch. Stephen tried repeatedly to make jokes about what had just happened, but they came across as defensive and petty rather than funny. He made several comments like, "I guess some people just can't take a joke," and "Hollywood egos, am I right?" trying to shift blame onto Samuel. But the studio audience barely responded to any of it. They'd all seen exactly what had happened with their own eyes. They'd watched Stephen deliberately provoke and insult a guest, then act shocked and victimized when that guest refused to tolerate the disrespect. The disconnect between Stephen's attempted spin and the reality everyone had just witnessed was jarring. The studio audience clearly picked up on all of this as it was unfolding. You could see it written all over their faces. The initial gasps and nervous laughter quickly gave way to uncomfortable silence and visible concern. They'd come to the taping expecting entertainment, expecting maybe some lighthearted banter between a famous actor and a popular television host. Instead, they got an up-close view of one person systematically disrespecting another person for no apparent reason other than manufacturing controversy. It was deeply uncomfortable to witness, even through a television screen. Being there in person must have been excruciating. Samuel's decision to walk off that stage wasn't impulsive or purely emotional, despite what Stephen tried desperately to suggest afterward. It was measured, deliberate, and principled. He gave Stephen multiple clear opportunities to course-correct and change direction. He answered the insulting questions initially, even though they were clearly designed to provoke him. He explained his positions thoughtfully and clearly. He tried several times to redirect the conversation to more productive, respectful territory, but Stephen wasn't interested in having a real conversation or productive discourse. He was only interested in manufactured conflict and drama. So Samuel made a choice. He did exactly what any person with genuine self-respect would do in that situation. He removed himself from a toxic environment that was becoming increasingly hostile. He refused to be used as a prop in Stephen's cynical attempt at creating edgy, controversial television. And he did it all with his dignity completely intact and his head held high. That's what made the entire moment so powerful and memorable. He didn't storm off in an uncontrolled rage. He didn't throw things or curse people out. He simply stated clearly that the situation was unacceptable, explained exactly why it was unacceptable, and then calmly walked away. It was a masterclass in maintaining composure while still standing firmly for your principles. The moment when Samuel carefully removed and handed back the microphone was particularly symbolic and powerful. That small microphone represented so much more than just a piece of audio equipment. It represented the show's attempt to control his voice, his narrative, his public image. By consciously removing it and handing it back to the crew, Samuel was taking complete control of his own story. He was saying clearly that Stephen and his show didn't get to use him, his name, or his platform for their purposes anymore. It was a quiet but incredibly powerful act of reclaiming agency and control. Stephen's clumsy attempts to continue the show afterward only served to highlight his complete inability to read the room or understand the gravity of what had just happened. The jokes he made about Hollywood egos and people not being able to take jokes revealed his absolute lack of self-awareness. He had just systematically insulted one of the most respected actors in the entire industry, deliberately provoked him until he felt compelled to leave, and was now somehow trying to position himself as the victim in the situation. It was genuinely embarrassing to watch unfold in real time. The musical guest who had to come out onto the stage much earlier than scheduled looked visibly uncomfortable with the entire situation. They'd almost certainly been watching everything unfold from backstage. They knew exactly what had just happened. Having to perform in that heavy, awkward atmosphere must have been incredibly difficult and uncomfortable. The energy in the studio was all wrong. The audience was still processing what they'd witnessed. You simply can't just bounce back from something that intense and pretend everything's completely fine and normal. But that's exactly what Stephen was desperately trying to do. As the show continued and eventually wound down toward its conclusion, Stephen seemed increasingly desperate to move past what had happened and return to normalcy. He rushed through segments that would normally be given more time. His comedic timing was noticeably off throughout. He kept glancing nervously at the producers stationed off camera, probably receiving instructions through his earpiece on how to handle the unprecedented situation. But there simply was no good way to handle it at that point. The damage had been done. The interview confrontation had become the story, completely overshadowing everything else that happened during the episode. The closing segment of the show was particularly telling and revealing. Stephen tried hard to end on an upbeat, positive note, thanking the audience enthusiastically for coming and thanking his guests for appearing. But his heart clearly wasn't in any of it. The words sounded hollow and forced. You could see it plainly in his body language, in the way he couldn't quite manage to meet the camera's gaze directly. The confident, self-assured, smirking host from earlier in the show had completely vanished, replaced by someone who looked genuinely rattled, shaken, and uncertain. This whole uncomfortable situation could have been completely avoided if Stephen had simply approached the interview with genuine curiosity and respect instead of manufactured controversy and conflict. If he had asked legitimately challenging questions without resorting to personal insults. If he had treated his guests like a human being deserving of basic respect and dignity. But he chose not to do any of those things. He made a calculated decision to provoke and antagonize, and that's ultimately why, when everything was said and done, it was Stephen who looked small, petty, and unprofessional, while Samuel walked away with his dignity intact and his head held high. The contrast couldn't have been more clear or more damning.